Well, the first out of the blocks is rolling resistance. Now, rolling resistance, they talk about it on a lot of these cycling magazine channels all the time. It's thrown around, and they're saying that, you know, these new clinchers, tubeless, hookless, whatever, the rolling resistance is better, and these tyres are the fastest tyres I've ever made. They're much faster than tubeless. Now, why I call them out on rolling resistance is because rolling resistance, even if you actually measure it between one tyre and another tyre, it's very, very small. So even at the best, the difference is very small wattage indeed. And the other reason is that rolling resistance is a very stable or linear wattage loss when you're riding your bike. So as you're riding along, the faster you get, that rolling resistance stays very consistent. Now, when you actually go faster, your drag, your wind drag is exponential. So what actually happens is this, once you start to get faster and faster, becomes the biggest resistance to you riding along by a huge degree. Now, when you actually look at this, you can actually see that as you go faster, the rolling resistance becomes a smaller percentage component of the whole drag that's involved in moving the bike forward. And an example of this is like, just say I was in a dark room, I lit a match, and that match lights up the room, and you can see everything in the room, and before you couldn't see anything. So it makes a huge difference at a very low light level. Now, if I turn the lights on and I light the match, I really can't see hardly any more. The light coming off the match is insignificant to the amount of light in the room. And that's exactly the same way it works on a bike. So even if you say, yeah, rolling resistance is a real thing, when you're riding at 30 kilometers an hour, the percentage of difference it makes actually becomes insignificant to the overall resistance you need to overcome to push the bike forward. Well, hysteresis is the second thing they talk about. Now, hysteresis is the ability of the material to return the energy that's been put into it. So an example of that would be one of those super balls, those little balls that you get in those machines where you might buy some gum, you get a little prize, and you get this ball that's made of a really hard polymer compound, and you bounce it, and the bounce is really high. So what it is it's returning a huge percentage of the energy you're putting into it when you throw it on the ground. The bounce is very high. Now, they're saying that this is what happens with a tyre. You know, when the tyre is compressed, it returns the energy, and we're supposed to believe that that goes into forward motion. But the reality is, the very high-end expensive tyres are made out of cotton and have a very high TPI. The threads are very, very thin. And they actually have a very poor hysteresis. If we can see here, this is just a cotton tyre. You can squeeze it, doesn't come back. It doesn't have any elastic function, whatever. It acts like a pillow, you squash it and it stays there. So how come then a tyre that has a very poor hysteresis are considered to be the premium tyres on the market? So I call BS on that one. And so to me, the hysteresis argument is not a factor. And I'll tell you why you actually don't want that in a tyre when we do the roll-up conclusion. Now, the third thing that actually shows that this whole rolling resistance, hysteresis, wider tyres are faster, is there's been a few people who've done their own tests on the internet, not sponsored by these big companies or sponsored by cycling magazines or whatever. They're just you and me guys out there, and they've done some test. And when they do these tests of different tyres, they actually find that there's very, very little difference. And this is just like typical rolling test down a hill, or they ride a specific circuit and hold a certain amount of watts and change the tyres. And the difference is almost negligible. It's almost within just normal variances that you would get from wind and all sorts of other environmental factors that could cause the bicycle to have a slightly slower or faster time. So the reality is, when you do a real test, the advantage you're getting with different tyres is extremely small. Now, the fourth thing that is a major factor, which no one talks about, is when you go to a wider tyre, the actual frame design has to be quite different. And if you actually look around the bottom bracket and you start to make the chainstays wider to accommodate a wider tyre, you get all sorts of problems. And you get a problem with the chainstay trying to be moved closer to your crankset, but it can't. So therefore you actually have to make compromises with your design of your frame to get it to go around the crankset and then back to the back wheel. And on the front and on the forks, you also have a much bigger gap from the tyre. So you may not be riding the biggest tyre, which is 32 millimeters, even though it can take it. You might be riding 28s. So you actually have a lot of space around that tyre. And it's the same on the back as well. You have a lot of space around the seat stays, and you have a lot of space around the tyre at the bottom near the crankset. Plus, they've actually had to design the chain stays and the seat stays differently to accommodate these tyres. And that actually creates compromises in the integrity and the aerodynamics of the frame. Now, when you actually talk about aerodynamics, you actually want the frame to be as close to the tyre as possible. And we actually had this with the TT bike from Pinarello, I think it was the Bolito, and they actually had an adjustment on the back so they could move the tyre in close to the frame to minimise that gap. And this has been known for years. You don't want gaps between the frame and the tyres. So going to a frame that can accommodate wider tyres is actually compromising your aerodynamics, and it's also compromising integrity and design of the frame. Now, in conclusion, I just want to talk about what the single biggest factor is in the variance of your tyre and the speed of your tyre going forward. And that actually is the surface, or the surface you're riding, and how smooth or how rough that is. Now, if it's very smooth, you can go to a higher pressure tyre and a very, very small patch area on the tyre, and you'll get the fastest time. But as the actual surface gets rougher and rougher and rougher, then you need to go to a wider tyre, which has a lower pressure and has a wider patch. So you can actually, one, maintain contact with the surface because it's uneven, and two, you also then stop that force that's pushing the bike up. And this is the biggest factor that they have for limiting your forward speed, because when you actually hit something like imperfections in the road or like a piece of wood, it's pushing the bike up. So you're having to lift the whole bike and the whole rider, and this takes away energy from your forward motion. And this is why they talk about lower pressures. Now, yes, lower pressures can be faster on a surface that is not smooth. And that makes the biggest difference to how fast a tyre is on a specific surface. But of course, as a bike and a tyre manufacturer, you can't control the surface you're riding on. So they don't like to talk about this very much. They don't like to talk about how they have actually studied this. And it's actually, if you actually go and do some research, you can actually find that Zip was one of the very first people to identify this in the Roubaix. They found that if you run the tyre at a lower pressure, it was actually much faster across the pavé. So guys, that really, all this thing about wideness of tyres and, you know, going, they're faster, more performance, is really a big myth. The only thing you get with a wider tyre is comfort. Everything else is either too small a difference compared to the aero drag, or it just isn't true. And I hope that kind of gives us a more wider scope of why wider tyres, or I believe wider tyres, are really not giving people the advantage that they may believe they're getting.